So, now we're going to continue this week's reading with cantos 16 through 18 of Purgatorio. Bum 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 bum, Purgatorio, bum 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 bum. Before we get into 16 through 18, let's back up just a little bit and finish Canto 15, because I stopped before we got to the Wrathful section, which is the end of Canto 15. So as we saw last time, Dante and Virgil were talking about love and the meaning of love, and we're going to continue discussing that idea throughout the next couple of cantos, and then we're going to sort of combine the ideas of love and free will in more rich discussion. Before they actually see the wrathful sinners here, Dante suddenly experiences the whip of wrath, that vision of the virtue that can help you overcome wrath. With the prideful, it was a sculpture that he looked at. It was a piece of art. With the envious, it was a voice that he heard. Now, it is going to be a vision. So he suddenly is like sort of slapped in the face with a vision, and he sees in a trance these three visions. The first is, of course, Mary, because the first one is always from the life of Mary, and it's Mary when Jesus went into the temple, when they went to Jerusalem and they left Jesus accidentally at the temple and were halfway home and realized they couldn't find their son, and so they turned around and went back to look for him. And when she remonstrates with him, when she questions him, she does it with meekness, with gentleness. Then comes the story of Pisistratus, and finally there's the story of Stephen the Martyr, the first Christian martyr. All three of these characters respond to a situation with meekness. So meekness is the virtue that challenges or counteracts wrath. Meekness is sometimes confused with the idea of weakness. It's not weakness. It's actually great strength that's held in check. So I have the power to react, but I choose instead to respond gently. So you might think of somebody who responds gently to conflict, somebody like Martin Luther King Jr., who constantly responded very peacefully to great violence and great atrocities, and by so doing, obviously showed great power and great strength. That's what we think of when we think of meekness. Stephen the Martyr prayed for the people who were killing him in a sort of a mirror with Jesus' crucifixion. We already mentioned the story of Mary. Pisistratus is a story where this man was having a conflict with this young man who wanted to marry his daughter, and the young man embraced his daughter in the street, and Pisistratus' wife was like, "Let's kill that guy!" And Pisistratus is like, no, calm down, let's be civil here. And so, it's the very untraditional father. Normally, you think of father figures are sort of idiomatically painted like this, the shotgun, don't touch my daughter. But Pisistratus is meek with the man who is flirting with his daughter. Anyway, all three of these stories demonstrate a sense of meekness, something that counteracts wrath. Wrath is this passion that responds with intense anger and hatred at your situation, but meekness sees a situation that could be very frustrating, that you could respond to with intensity, strength, and anger, but instead you respond to with gentleness, and it shows that you a kind of inner strength. And Virgil says, "Hey, Dante, where are you? Your head's kind of floating around. You're kind of staggering instead of walking normally," because he's just seen these visions. He's sort of lost contact with reality for a moment. And Dante begins to explain, and Virgil says, no, I understand. I just wanted you to take it to heart. I wanted you to realize what's going on and not sort of just brush this lesson off. You got to learn meekness. Dante himself has a bit of an issue with wrath. It's not his primary problem. Pride is really his primary problem. But Dante does respond kind of angrily. He has a lot to be angry about. He responds kind of intensely, kind of angrily sometimes to a situation, and so he also has to realize, I need to respond with meekness. I need to keep myself in control here, in spite of what everyone else in the world does to me, which we're going to see, of course. A reminder, this is set in 1300, and Dante's going to be exiled just a couple years, and when that happens, a lot of people are really going to wrong him. He needs to keep himself in check. And we're moving towards the evening. It's getting later and later, but even faster than the evening comes on comes this huge billowing cloud of smoke that just obscures everything. And so if you've ever had one of those quick changes in the weather where it's kind of getting towards evening, but all of a sudden the weather changes and gets really dark really fast, it seems to almost bring on the evening much faster. Well, this billowing smoke that covers them brings the darkness much more quickly than the failing light does. And so it's not actually night yet, but the smoke obscures everything. And of course, this smoke is what we see in the next canto, which is the contrapasso for the Wrathful. Okay, let me talk a little bit about the contrapasso for the Wrathful, because it confuses me, personally. Okay, so it's a dense cloud of very acrid smoke, which is stinging their eyes, making it difficult to see. It's just miserable. Let's try to identify how that is a counterpoint to wrath. Okay, so far we've seen the prideful with the weight on their shoulders, pushing down that, they thought they were so great, and so they have to be pushed down a little bit. The envious, who were constantly looking at other people and wanting what they had, their eyes are stitched shut, so they no longer are looking outward and no longer looking at those things that they wanted. Now that brings us to the Wrathful, who are surrounded by this intense smoke. The first conclusion that we could easily jump to, and the one that I think is sort of the traditional version, is that this thick cloud of smoke represents the way wrath clouds our vision, and it represents the way we're sort of surrounded by it and drowning in it. And that makes sense, but the problem with that, as I see it, is that sounds a lot more like an Inferno kind of contrapasso than it does a Purgatorio kind of contrapasso. In Inferno, the souls were continuing in the action they've always done, so the lustful souls who are blown around by their passions are again blown around by the wind. So if the Wrathful were blinded by their wrath in this smoke, does it make sense for them to be blinded by a smoke? Shouldn't what they're experiencing be a counterpoint, an opposite, a turning from what they previously experienced? So in what way is a smoke a counter to wrath? Well, one idea I have, which may be completely wrong, is the fact that wrath is like a flame. It's a burning impulse. It's a fiery kind of impulse. And smoke is the smoldering of a flame. It is when you put out a flame, when you trample a flame, it turns to smoke. So perhaps it's the undoing of the flame of wrath. That could be a stretch. I don't know, I just made that up, but it's the idea that I came up with. I'd love to hear some other ideas that might possibly show that this is a counterpoint to wrath. Maybe it's a little bit more convoluted and obscure. There were moments in the Inferno, after all, where what they were doing didn't seem to be necessarily a continuation, but a reversal, like the soothsayers who are constantly trying to see the future and now their heads are on backwards. That kind of feels like a Purgatorio kind of contrapasso. Maybe it's one of those that are slightly less clear. Anyway, as usual, the souls are praying. You notice this pattern here? Every time we meet the souls in Purgatory, they're praying, which is very different from the completely self-absorbed and guilt-deferring souls of the Inferno. In the Inferno, the souls were always complaining, and they were blaming someone else, blame displacement, and they were, weeping about their own misery. Whereas in Purgatorio, even though the souls are being punished, they have great attitudes about it, and they're constantly praying. So we meet them in a state of prayer, and then we also end each cornice with a song. And the souls here are praying for the pardon of the Lamb of God. Notice the Lamb of God is, of course, one of the key symbols for Jesus. He was the sacrificial lamb. But another symbol for Jesus is the lion, right? The Lion of Judah. Okay, and both of those symbols are, in contrast to each other. They show different aspects of the Christ. But the lion is a very intense and powerful figure who rushes in and destroys the enemies of the Christian people. On the other hand, we have the Lamb, who is very meek and very mild and is ultimately given up as a sacrifice for the sins of the people. Well, the Lamb really represents the meekness of Christ. And so when they pray to the Lamb, again, that is a recognition of their need for meekness. Also, notice how they're very unified. All of their prayers are in unison and all said together, and that shows the way that they are overcoming the divisiveness of wrath. When you're angry, it tends to cause conflict between people. Anger never really brings us together. And so here they are being brought back together by their turning towards meekness. And as Dante begins to talk, they hear him and they say, hey, wait, that guy sounds like, because you can't see through the smoke, that guy sounds like he is still part of the living. He is still measuring his life by time. As opposed to them who are in the afterlife, they're no longer measuring their life in time. They're out of time. They are part of the afterlife. And so Dante begins to talk to one of them, and the two of them walk together and follow each other, except, of course, Dante can't actually see this person through the thick, painful smoke, and instead they follow each other by sound, by listening. And as Dante begins to explain his situation, he sort of recaps the things that have been said before, like the way Sepia talked about how Dante must be really loved by God to be given this journey. Notice how many times that's mentioned? Here he says it again. Since God's love encloses me in grace so bounteous that he permits me to behold his court by means wholly unknown to modern use, etc. Notice the way, again, we keep referring to God's love for Dante, because God's love throughout this whole section is very, very key. The idea of love is very important to Purgatory. And of course, we're going to see more explanation of that in just a moment. And so here we meet Marco Lombardi, or Marco of Lombard. And we have the same sort of conversation we have with most people down here. He points the stair out to them, or at least says, I'll sort of walk you that direction, and also asks for prayers when Dante returns to the world, because Dante's capable of that. So the usual. But then they move into another kind of conversation. Dante wants clarity, because Marco references the good that nobody really seems to be doing anymore. The idea that civilization, the idea that society, is really pretty rotten these days. And Dante wants to know why. Why does society seem to just kind of go downhill sometimes? Why is it that everyone seems to just really do terrible things? We know that this is connected back to his concept of Florence, the way Italy is torn apart by war, religious war, civil war. It's just a mess. Everybody's fighting back and forth. Why are things so rotten? And Dante asks, the world, as you have said, is truly bare of every trace of good, swollen with evil, and by evil overshadowed everywhere. But wherein lies the fault? I beg to know that I may see the truth and so teach others. Some see it in the stars, some here below. Where did the problem come from? Why is everything so rotten? And Marco sees that Dante really is very confused here, and that Dante doesn't have a clear spiritual understanding of the problem. Dante keeps returning to a physical understanding instead of the spiritual understanding. Just like in the last part of this week's section, where they talked about the love and the issue of love, the way there's a difference between the sharing of wealth and the sharing of love. Wealth is finite. There's only so many resources in the world, and so to divide it up means to lose some. And every time you lose some, someone else is gaining some. Every time they lose some, you might be gaining some. It just goes back and forth. The wheel of fortune. Well, love just can spread and spread and spread, and grows as it spreads. It's the opposite kind of resource. Well, here, again, Dante's thinking about the physical and not understanding the spiritual. He's saying, okay, is evil really from fate? Is it from, something, inside of us? Why do people tend towards evil? We're going to continue this discussion when we get to the idea of love in the next couple cantos and blend the two together. So there's two really key components here. There's will and there's love. In this section, we really talk about free will. We're going to blend the two ideas, though, as we go. So Marco points out that in the world, we are influenced by fate, by destiny, by the stars, all that sort of stuff. That influences us. It sets our inclinations. We could say, in today's day where we don't really necessarily believe that the stars influence who we are, we could say that your genetics, your environment, all those characteristics influence our outcomes. But does that mean we are not responsible for our actions? Does that mean that we're not responsible for the things that we do? Let's say I have terrible genes and terrible parents. That means I'm more predisposed towards a rotten path. But in the end, do I choose? Could I choose good instead of that rotten path? Sure. And so who's at fault in the final moment? Well, there's a lot of influences leading me that direction, but could I still turn things around? Dante puts it on humanity and says, okay, it's our own fault. We still have the choice. We can still rein in those predispositions and turn them another way. It's hard, but it can be done. But here he also gets to why society as a whole tends towards evil in his day, and in other days as well. There are times when things just really seem crummy, like whole civilizations just really rotten and going downhill. And Dante points out that that problem, where we see something, we desire it with some sort of natural desire, if we go down that path, if it's not the path for good, it will ultimately lead us towards destruction. So I see something, let's say that I really like potato chips. Well, potato chips are fine, you can eat some potato chips, but let's say that I just get obsessed with potato chips to the cost of everything else. But the real problem why the whole society seems to be going downhill is because of bad leadership. Now, as each person individually, seeks after those desires, and then those desires lead them from the good, well, that's bad enough on the individual scale, but when a leader, especially a religious leader, seeks after something that's not the ultimate good, they set behind the greater good for this smaller pleasure, and they seek it to excess, that leads them astray, but also as leaders, it sets the example and the temperature, I guess, of the whole society. So as your leaders go wrong, then the whole society really begins to rot, because the normal people are usually only going to live up to the standards of their leadership. And if those standards are low, well, we just go downhill from there. It is still on the individual to be the exception, to stand up for good in spite of your society, in spite of your leaders, but it's a lot harder, and things tend to go bad if you have bad leaders, not setting the right example. That's why Dante has such an issue with bad religious leaders. All those really rotten popes that Dante just chews out in the Inferno, well, he's still got problems with him here. He points out at the end of this canto and says, "And now I know why Levi's sons alone could not inherit wealth in Israel. In the tribes of Israel, the one tribe which was the religious leadership tribe, the one that all the priests came from, Levi, they didn't inherit land. They just got to be spread throughout the country, and they had no particular land of their own." And Dante's saying the church needs to do that too. This church, which is taking political power, is causing the religious things just to fall apart. All these popes who are desiring political power, they are losing sight of good and just setting a horrible trend throughout society and really destroying society. Of course, Marco does mention some good exceptions. Just like we always know, whenever society is bad, there's still good people out there. There's still people who are the exceptions to the rule, and Dante needs to keep that in mind. He makes a special point of talking about Gerard, who was the father of Gaia. And Gerard is set up as an example of good, but it also specifically references Gaia, his daughter, who was, according to the stories, kind of loose and not a very good woman. And so again, we see that contrast between parents and their children. Just because a parent is bad doesn't mean the child will be bad. Just because the parent is good also doesn't mean that the child will be good. And so it's about the individual. The individual's independent will sets their place. Free will is a thing, according to Dante here. Okay, so you remember how Inferno was so intent on punishment is about the will? It's your own fault. You're here. You're still hanging on to what you always did. Well, will is still very important. We're still going to discuss that idea. But here we're combining it with also love. How do love and will combine? How do love and will interact? And so as they reach the end of the smoky section, Marco points out the angel up there, and Dante moves out of the smoke, and it's left behind. And oh, look, there's still some light around. Yay, it's not completely night yet. See there across the smoke, like dawn's first rays, the lights swell like a glory and a guide. The angel of this place gives forth that blaze, and it is not fit he see me, says Marco. So Marco cannot continue up yet. He has not fully purged the wrath from himself, and so he says, no, I can't go up there yet. I gotta stay back here in the smoke. At the beginning of Canto 17, again we see one of those sort of long extended metaphors that Dante loves to do. Every few cantos, he likes to open with some big, long, extended metaphor. And here he talks about when a mountain mist suddenly clears away and you begin to see the sunlight through it. That's what this was like as the smoke began to thin and all of a sudden the light shines through it. But before he gets there, he has another series of visions, which are the reign of wrath. Just the same, at the end of each cornice in Purgatorio, Dante experiences the reign, the whatever it is that teaches him what will happen if this particular vice, if this particular sin is carried too far. And so we see what happens when wrath is carried too far, how it leads to destruction. We see Procne, we see Amata, we see the story of Haman in the book of Esther, and all of these people who destroyed themselves through their wrath. Their wrath was directed towards different sources, just like at the beginning, the meekness was directed towards different kinds of people. Meekness towards your family, meekness towards your friends, meekness towards your enemies, even. Here we see that wrath is directed towards different types. But again, all those wraths are destructive. No matter where you direct your wrath, it's going to eat you up and destroy you. And we see the shiny angel, who's again blindingly bright. Although Dante's, as the peas are wiped away, Dante's endurance actually grows. It's not that the angels get dimmer, but it's that Dante's endurance for them is strengthened. And once again, he fans the pea off of Dante's head and sings to Dante as Dante ascends. And again, this is about blessed are the peacemakers. Again, the meek will create peace. Wrath instead stirs up contention. Notice how each of these songs is sort of a beatitude as well. It's a song about how one ought to be, tying back to the virtue. But as Dante climbs up to the next cornice, it's getting darker and darker. The sun is starting to go down. The night is falling. And as they finally step onto the cornice, the fourth cornice, the light goes, and so it's night, and Dante can no longer ascend. He feels the weight of the night. We mentioned earlier that when the sun is shining on us, we can progress, but as soon as night falls, there is no moving up. There is no continuing to ascend. And so Dante is stuck on this cornice for the night. He's going to have to stop here. However, presumably he can walk around on the cornice, he just can't go up. But it also seems he's really tired and kind of sluggish. We're going to note that a few times here because it ties into the particular problem of this cornice, which is sloth. "Oh, strength, why do you melt away?" I said several times over to myself, for now it seemed my legs were turning into lead. So Dante's kind of looking around, and because they can't really go anywhere yet, he decides to talk with Virgil, and Virgil and he have a chat about love. And this relates perfectly to Canto 11 of Inferno. And so we see the same sort of connection here. In Inferno, when we got to Canto 11, they had just gotten to the ledge, and they were beginning to descend into the 7th circle of the Inferno. But as they descended, the smell became so strong that they stopped and took a canto rest, and Virgil explained the organization of the Inferno. Do you remember that? Well, here we are. Again, it is night, so we can no longer climb, and so they stop and they take a break. And Virgil explains the organization of Purgatory. And so we've waited all this time to get to the organization of Purgatory. We've finally gotten there. True to Dante style. Dante always has us go through the experience, and then about halfway through, or more than halfway through, he stops us and says, "Let me explain what you've just been doing. Here's the structure of Purgatory." So of course the first big section of Purgatorio was not Purgatory, it was the outside of the mountain, where the souls are waiting to enter Purgatory. Now that we're actually in Purgatory and we've gotten halfway up Purgatory, we're going to explain the organization and the structure of Purgatory. Purgatory is structured on love, and how love works. Again, they're going to gather good fruit from delay. And here we explain what love is, but there are different kinds of love. There's the kind of love that is eternal and perfect, but there's also the more natural kind of love. There's also the mind-directed kind of love, the kind of love that comes from in ourselves. And so we have the eternal kind of love, but we also have the love that comes from looking at something and deciding we love it and becoming very attached to it. And that's a good thing, but it can be misdirected. And so Purgatory is based all upon the wrong ways to love. The first 3 cornices, which we've already experienced, were based upon bad love. They're based upon a kind of love that is very selfish and self-seeking, as opposed to looking at others and seeking the good of others. So we saw how all three of these first cornices are very outward directed. The prideful thinks we are so great. The envious looks at others and wishes them poorly for our own benefit. Again, the Wheel of Fortune. We want them down, so we go up. And the wrathful is a kind of anger and hatred towards others. So all three of those are about lifting the self up and destroying others. They're all very negative kinds of self-love, or loving things that other people have, and so we wish them poorly. That's a bad love. Now we are in Cornice 4, where the slothful are. These are those who love too little. They see what's good, and they go, yeah, that's good. I should probably do that. But I don't really feel like it. I think I'll just take a break. And this clears up a lot for us the slothful that we saw in the Inferno. We didn't actually see the slothful in the Inferno. They were at the bottom of the river. Do you remember that? The bottom of the Styx, coupled with the wrathful. And sometimes they are called the sullen. Sometimes the slothful, sometimes the sullen. How is sloth and sullenness the same thing? Well, they both have to do with seeing something good, but not being willing to go after it. The sullen are too sulky to seek what's good. I know it's good, but I don't feel like it. Meh. And the slothful are too lazy to seek after the good. Both of them see what's good, but they're like, I don't feel it. And so their love for the good is too weak. The next three cornices are those who love too much. Now, how can you love too much? That doesn't make any sense. Love is a good thing. You should have as much of it as you like. After all, a little bit ago, we talked about how sharing love makes more love. Isn't more love good? Well, yes, but we're kind of differentiating between divine love and other kinds of love here. See, Dante says that eternal love, the true, greatest love, that you can have as much of it as you like. That's divine love. And that's wonderful. That should be your first focus. But sometimes there are other things that you love too, and it's good to love them. After all, good foods are wonderful, and they are a gift from God. So I love God, and I love his gifts. He gave me good food, he gave me a great body, he gave me all kinds of poetry. It's wonderful. I love everything because God gave me all of this. That's the good attitude from Dante. But Dante says if you lose sight of the greater love and you focus too much on the smaller loves, you love them too much, then they cause you problems. And so the next three cornices are about loving things too much. It's good to love things, but not too much. So we'll have greed and gluttony and lust, those pleasures, those physical pleasures, which in moderation and in their appropriate place are wonderful, but to excess distract you from greater love. So that's the structure of Purgatorio. Notice, again, 3 sections, just like in Inferno, 3 sections. And here also, we have 3 cornices, a divide, 1 cornice, a divide, and 3 cornices. Tripartite. Tripartite in all, and 2 of the sections are tripartite, but 7 in all. Again, all kinds of really important numbers. Sloth is the turning point between the 2. Quiet! Yeah, you! I don't care. And so now that brings us to Canto 18, where Dante, they're still sitting here, Dante asks for more clarification. Okay, I get the whole love structure thing. Give me some more understanding of love. At first, Dante again doesn't really want to ask, but Virgil sees his need and continues to explain. Virgil is the great teacher here, just like before. He's guiding Dante and helping Dante through this. Let's talk about the kind of love that leads us in all different directions, both good and evil. And so Dante wants more explanation of, this problem. How do we choose good over bad? And how does love tie into that? In other words, how are free will and love linked? And so Virgil explains, okay, the process through which we fall in love with things. There's something that I see, and at first I look at it. It's Dante. This looks interesting. And the more I look at it, the more I appreciate its form and its substance. Oh, this is poetry, and this is really good poetry. And then it becomes something that I deeply love. And so that happens. I love Dante, and it took me a process. The first time I read Dante, I didn't really understand him, and I was young, I was a kid, but my appreciation for him grew until now. This is great stuff. This is some of my favorite poetry ever. And Dante says, okay, I understand how love is created, but now there's an even greater doubt I feel. If love springs from outside the soul's own will, and it being made to love, what merit is there in loving good or blame in loving ill? Again, back to the idea of free will. So love, is something big. Everybody loves. It's natural to love. All things are really motivated by love, right? Even if love corrupts sometimes, if we love the wrong things, all things are motivated by love. Everything is naturally loved. So how can we be blamed? Back to sort of Francesca's problem, right? Here, if love is the source of everything, then how can I be blamed for loving ill? And how can I be praised for loving good? I mean, what is there in that? Again, just like before, there's a predisposition here, but there's still also the choice. Fireflies! Virgil explains, and he says, put it this way. All love, let us say, that burns in you springs from necessity, but you still have the power to check its sway. So I may really love that cookie, but I still can shut my mouth and not eat it. These noble powers Beatrice will comprehend as the free will. Keep that term well in mind if she should speak of it when you ascend. So Beatrice will clear things up much more. Virgil can only explain things so far as poetry and reason can explain them, but Beatrice will ultimately explain the divine implications of what we're talking about here. So, there is the possibility to check the things I love. I might really, really love one particular hobby, but I can also stop myself from doing it if it's leading me too far. It's nearly midnight now, not now, but in the book, and instead of continuing the conversation, Dante's getting sluggish in his discussion. I, being pleased to find such clear and open answers to my questions, was rambling drowsily within my mind. I'm just kinda casually thinking about these good things instead of actively seeking to learn from the good. Notice that they are not wanting to move very much. He's thinking drowsily. He's rambling drowsily. He's not really setting himself to learn this stuff because he's expressing the sin of sloth, not actively seeking after the good, but being really, being really kind of lazy about it. Suddenly, he wakened. So he's wakened. He has this moment of drowsiness, which reminds us of the very beginning of the Inferno. Remember why he went wrong in the first place? It's because he wasn't paying attention. He was kind of sleepily walking along, not focused, and he went wrong. But he's wakened by this mob of people running by. And the first few of them, the front runners, are shouting out, "Mary ran to the hills." And so these two front-runner souls shout out instances of people running, people having zeal to do what's right. These are examples of zealousness, the counterpoint to sloth. If you're really zealous and you're determined, you're going to do good, as opposed to the slothful who just can't get themselves into it. Notice again, the first one's Mary. This is the whip of sloth. It's the urgent to be zealous. And then the rest of the pack runs by really quick. Dante has just a moment to talk to one of the souls, the abbot of San Zeno. And as usual, they ask for directions, and as always, they go right. "Come after us, and you will find the hole. The will to move on with all speed so fills us we cannot stop. We humbly beg your pardon if duty makes us seem discourteous." And so he tells his story, but he does it at a full run. And so Dante's like, kind of keeping up for a minute. He hears a little bit of the story, but by the time they get to the end of the story, the guy's gone. He's not going to stop and wait for Dante because they're determined to seek after the good now. That's their contrapasso. That's their undoing of their previous slothfulness. Also notice here when Virgil first asks for help, he points out, hey, this guy who's alive needs help up the mountain, which is the same sort of thing they do every time. We follow the same pattern. But notice how the souls do not care that Dante's alive. Nobody cares. Nobody mentions anything about it. They're like, yeah, just keep going. We gotta go for the good. These souls are so focused on what's right and what's good that little things that normally distract the other souls from their situation do not distract these guys. These guys are set on doing what's good, on seeking the good, because that's what they need to overcome their sloth, their light love. Dante gets in another religious jab here. He mentions this one person who was a political leader who put his son made his son an abbot, even though his son was not well suited for it, for lots and lots of reasons, being mentally challenged and being physically disabled. All of those reasons do not make him a good abbot. And so Dante points out, again, the mix of politics and religion, how frustrating that is and how that messes things so much up. And as the souls run by, the last few souls, who are the tail of the pack, they are the ones who are shouting the reign. So we saw the first few of the pack shout the whip, the last few of the pack shout the reign, and the rest of the souls just run past. Notice how quick this explanation is. This is the shortest cornice yet, the shortest explanation of a sin yet. All the others we've taken a couple of cantos to look at. These are done in like a page. It's because Sloth is just determined to run by. We're getting rid of the Sloth, we're zooming by, and so it's a very true, even in the speed that we move through this section, very true to the situation here, as Dante always is. The last two point out those Israelites who were not zealous to enter the Promised Land, and so they had to wander around for 40 years in the desert and die. And also those who were not zealous to follow Aeneas, as he sought to found the new city, ultimately founding Rome, of course, from Virgil's own story, the Aeneid. And so those followers of his who dropped off, they were too unwilling, and that led to their destruction. Both these people, through their sloth and through their lack of determination to do what's right, they ended up in a bad way. Notice something interesting here as well. This is the only time that the whip only has 2 stories. Up till now, it's always been 3. It always starts with Mary and then has 2 others. This time, there are only 2. I think that's interesting. I'm not entirely sure why, unless it's to indicate that Sloth, again, we're moving more quickly, and so we rapidly move past these things. We race past it. Or maybe there's only 2 examples or those 2 examples really show everything there is to show about it. The spiritual and the historical version. I don't know. But before we close, because it's getting really dark out here, before we close, notice how Dante ends. He ends by falling asleep, which you think is, sounds kind of like Sloth. Oh, so now after listening to zealousness, he's just like, I'm going to sleep. No, notice how he falls asleep here. A new thought seized upon me, and it bred so many more, so various and so scrambled, that turning round and round inside itself so many ways at once, my reason rambled. I closed my eyes, and all that tangled theme was instantly transformed into a dream. Contrast that with his drowsily thinking about love earlier. He's just kind of casually thinking, and all of a sudden here we learn about zealousness. Well, afterwards, it's not that he just gets sleepy and decides to lie down and fall asleep. It's that his mind is racing through all these new ideas. He's like, wait, I gotta process this in a dream. Because after all, this is dream time. The early morning hours are the times when Dante dreams prophetic dreams. And so instead of just being lazy and sleeping, this is a moment of processing and understanding. And so his next vision dream that he's going to experience, like the one we saw previously with the eagle, is going to be a sorting through all of his new ideas. But it's a very active thing. It's actively seeking the good as opposed to just sort of lazily thinking about it. That brings us to the end of this week's session, and we will continue with next week's cantos next time. I'm really enjoying this, as I've said. Next time we're going to do 19 through 24 and look at the next couple of cornices. We're going to rapidly move to the top of the mountain. Thanks so much for watching. I'm really loving this, Harrison, and I can't wait to look at the next section and hear more about your thoughts on this week's cantos. I'll see you next time. Bum 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 bum, Purgatorio, ba bum 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 bum.